Let me ask you something. If someone told you that one of the most reliable income sources you've been counting on for retirement might be reduced in the next decade, what would you do with that information? Would you panic? Would you ignore it and hope for the best? Or would you take a quiet, clear-eyed look at the facts and make a plan? That last option is exactly what we're going to do today. I'm Clara Morgan, and this channel is about helping you build real clarity around retirement. Not fear, not noise, just the facts you need to make good decisions. And today, we are going to talk about something that is generating a lot of anxiety right now: the Social Security funding shortfall and what it may actually mean for your retirement income. Here's how I want to walk through this with you. First, I'll explain what the shortfall actually is and why the worst case scenario most people imagine is not the most likely one. Then, I'll walk you through the history of how Congress has handled Social Security funding crises before, because this is not the first time we've been here. After that, we'll look at the most realistic paths forward, based on the Social Security Administration's own data. And finally, I'll give you practical, concrete steps you can take right now, depending on where you are in your retirement timeline. This is going to be grounded in facts, rooted in history, and focused on what you can actually do. Let's get into it. The 2025 Social Security Trustees Report projects that the primary trust funds supporting retirement and survivor benefits will be depleted around 2033, roughly 8 years from now. If Congress takes no action before that point, Social Security would only have incoming payroll tax revenue to draw from, and that incoming revenue would cover approximately 77 cents of every dollar in scheduled benefits. In plain language, a roughly 23% across-the-board reduction in benefits for every recipient, at the same time with no warning. Now, I want to be very clear about something, because this is where a lot of people get the wrong idea. Social Security would not disappear. The program would not shut down. Payroll taxes would still be flowing in every single week from working Americans across the country, and that money would still be paying benefits, just not at the full promised level. Think of it this way. Imagine you have a household budget where your monthly income normally covers all your bills. If your income dropped by 23%, you wouldn't stop paying every single bill. You'd cover what you could with what you have coming in. That's essentially what Social Security would be doing in a depletion scenario, continuing to pay benefits, just not the full amount. Does that make the problem small? Absolutely not. For millions of Americans, Social Security isn't a supplement, it is the primary source of retirement income. A 23% reduction would be genuinely painful for many households. But the difference between reduced benefits and no benefits is enormous, and it matters for how we think about this problem and how we plan around it. I want to share my honest assessment of what I think is most likely to happen, and I'll be upfront that this is my informed opinion based on historical patterns, not a guarantee. My view is that there is roughly an 85% probability that Congress acts before any abrupt benefit cut takes effect. Here's why I believe that. Social Security recipients are one of the most politically active groups in the country. Older Americans vote consistently and in high numbers. Any member of Congress who allowed millions of retirees and disabled Americans to experience a sudden, automatic income cut would face enormous political consequences. The incentive to prevent that outcome is extraordinarily strong. It cuts across party lines. Beyond the politics, we have actual precedent. The United States has faced a Social Security funding cliff before, and Congress stepped in. Understanding that history is important because it tells us not just whether Congress is likely to act, but how they are likely to act. What I think is most probable is a two-stage response. First, a near-term patch, something that prevents the immediate cut and buys time without requiring a comprehensive long-term overhaul. Second, a more structural solution that follows later, possibly bundled into broader budget negotiations. This is very consistent with how Congress has operated throughout the history of the program. Could Congress do nothing at all? Yes, technically. I'd put that probability around 15%. It is possible, but based on everything we know about political incentives and historical behavior, it is not the most likely path.
Before we look at the history, I want to make sure you understand how Social Security is actually organized, because this context is essential for understanding the options on the table. Social Security is not a single unified fund. It operates through two separate trust accounts, both funded by the same 12.4% payroll tax that workers and employers split equally. But that shared tax gets divided between two destinations by law. The first is the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund. This is the account that pays retirement benefits, spousal benefits, and survivor benefits. This is the trust fund facing depletion around 2033. The second is the Disability Insurance Trust Fund. This account covers disability benefits for workers who cannot continue working due to a qualifying condition. According to the 2025 Trustees Report, this fund is projected to remain solvent well past 2099. It is in a fundamentally healthier position than the retirement trust. Why does this distinction matter? Because one of the quieter tools Congress has used repeatedly over the decades is simply adjusting how that shared payroll tax gets divided between the two trusts. No new taxes, no benefit cuts, just a change in the flow of existing revenue between accounts. This is called a reallocation. Congress has done this in 1977, 1980, 1983, 1994, and 2015. The most recent example is instructive. In 2015, the Disability Insurance Trust was nearing depletion. Congress shifted 0.57 percentage points of the payroll tax from the Retirement Trust to the Disability Trust. Disability benefits were protected, no cuts, no tax increases, no disruption. Here's the important nuance, though. Reallocation alone cannot solve today's problem the way it could in 2015. The disability trust is healthy, which means there isn't a large surplus there to redirect. A reallocation could buy some additional time, but it doesn't address the underlying structural funding gap. It would be a bridge, not a solution. 1983 is the clearest example of how Congress handles a true Social Security funding emergency, and it deserves a careful look. By early 1983, the trustees had projected that the Retirement Trust Fund could run dry as soon as that summer. Literally, within months, checks could have been affected. Congress passed and President Reagan signed a reform package in April 1983, just a few months before projected insolvency. What did that reform package actually do? The centerpiece was accelerating payroll tax increases that were already scheduled for the future. Rather than waiting for those higher rates to phase in gradually over many years, Congress moved the timeline forward. In practical terms, the payroll tax rate went from just over 10% in the early 1980s to the 12.4% rate we have today, and it reached that level faster than originally planned. Each percentage point increase brought in significant new revenue almost immediately, tens of billions of dollars in early 1980s terms, which rapidly rebuilt the trust fund's reserves. Alongside that, Congress introduced income taxation of Social Security benefits for higher-earning retirees. Up to 50% of benefits became taxable for individuals above certain income thresholds. That 85% taxation level that many people are familiar with today came later. It wasn't part of the 1983 package. The reform also included very gradual increases to the full retirement age, taking effect over a long period of time so that no current retirees were affected immediately, and modest trust fund reallocations. What Congress did not do in 1983 was cut benefits for current recipients. That was the explicit political and policy goal: prevent the immediate disruption, restore cash flow quickly, and buy enough time to deal with longer-term challenges in future sessions. Now let's look at the tools Congress actually has available today using the Social Security Administration's own actuarial scoring.
The 2025 Trustees Report estimates the long-range funding shortfall at 3.82% of taxable payroll. That is the size of the gap we are trying to close. Every option Congress considers gets measured against that number. This is the tool Congress used most visibly in 1983, accelerating rate increases to bring in more revenue faster. Today, the math is less favorable. A phased increase in the payroll tax rate from 12.4% to 13%, or even 13.4%, would close only a small fraction of the overall gap and push the depletion date back by perhaps 1 year. That's not nothing, but it's far from sufficient on its own. A rate-only solution, meaning fixing the entire shortfall purely through higher payroll tax rates, would require raising that rate to approximately 16.4%. That would mean a substantial increase in the payroll taxes paid by every working American and every employer. The political resistance to that would be severe, making it a highly unlikely standalone approach. Currently, the Social Security payroll tax only applies to earned wages up to an annual cap, a figure that adjusts each year with wage growth but sits in the $170,000 range as of recent years. Earnings above that cap are not subject to Social Security payroll taxes. When Social Security was designed, the cap was set to capture roughly 90% of all wages earned in the United States. Today, because higher incomes have grown faster than the cap has risen, the tax only reaches about 82 to 83% of total wages. A growing share of high-income earnings sits above the cap and contributes nothing to the program. Option 1 is to restore that 90% coverage threshold, essentially raising the cap so that 90% of all wages are subject to the tax again. This would eliminate roughly 22 to 28% of the long-term shortfall and push depletion out by approximately 3 to 4 years. It has strong historical grounding and moderate political resistance. Option 2 is to apply the payroll tax to earnings above a high threshold, such as $250,000 or $400,000, without providing additional benefit credits for those earnings. This is sometimes called the donut hole approach, because earnings between the current cap and that high threshold would still be exempt. According to the Social Security Administration's own actuarial tables, the $250,000 version of this approach would eliminate approximately 65% of the long-term shortfall and push depletion from the mid-2030s to the late 2050s. That is more than 2 additional decades of runway. Why is this option particularly significant? Because it doesn't raise taxes on most workers. The vast majority of American households earn well below $250,000 per year. This change would affect a relatively small number of high earners while generating an enormous amount of additional revenue. It's easy to communicate politically, and it produces cash flow immediately, exactly the kind of result Congress needed in 1983. Option 3 is eliminating the payroll tax cap entirely. This would eliminate between 48 and 67% of the long-term shortfall, depending on whether corresponding benefit credits are extended, and could push depletion 20 to 25 years further into the future. However, it fundamentally changes the nature of Social Security as a program. Social Security was designed as a contributory, earned benefit system. The more you pay in over your working years, the more you receive in retirement, up to a defined limit. When high earners pay taxes on income well above that limit without receiving proportional benefits in return, the system starts functioning less like an insurance program and more like a general income redistribution mechanism. This matters for how the program is understood and supported politically. A full cap removal is a more aggressive option, with significantly higher political resistance, making it less likely as part of an early response, but it may enter the conversation in a later, more comprehensive reform. Based on the Social Security Administration's own actuarial menu of options and the historical behavior of Congress, here is what I think a realistic sequence of events looks like. Step 1. A targeted, near-term patch. As we approach the depletion date, and I mean genuinely approach, likely within a year or two of actual insolvency, Congress will act to prevent the immediate cut. The primary tool is most likely a high earner add-on payroll tax, structured similarly to the donut hole approach I described. This option eliminates a large portion of the long-term gap, generates revenue immediately, affects only a small percentage of workers, and is defensible to voters across the political spectrum. This may be paired with a modest, phased rate increase, not because a small rate increase solves the problem structurally, but because it allows lawmakers to say that everyone contributed something, not just high earners. It's a political layer more than a financial one. But Congress has used symbolic elements like this before to build coalition support for necessary legislation. This step would likely be accompanied by a trust fund reallocation if the disability trust has any surplus capacity available, simply to maximize the immediate stabilizing effect. Step 2. A longer-term structural adjustment. Once the immediate crisis is resolved, once checks are no longer at risk, the urgency subsides and Congress historically moves more slowly. The harder structural decisions get bundled into later budget negotiations, sometimes years down the road. This is where options like restoring the 90% wage coverage target or a partial cap removal are most likely to surface. These changes are meaningful but incremental, and they feel consistent with the way Congress prefers to move on politically sensitive issues, in layers over time, with each step presented as reasonable and measured. A comprehensive, permanent solution that fully closes the 75-year gap in a single piece of legislation, the kind of sweeping overhaul that policy experts often call for, is historically very rare. Congress prefers to solve the crisis at hand and revisit the rest later. Now let's bring this home, because the most important question isn't what Congress will do. The most important question is, what should you do? Your retirement security cannot depend entirely on decisions made in Washington, but it absolutely can be structured to account for the range of outcomes that are actually on the table. Here's how to think about that depending on where you are in your timeline. If you are within 10 years of retirement, Social Security is close enough that it should be part of your specific planning, but far enough away that there is still meaningful uncertainty about the details. The most practical step you can take right now is to model your retirement income plan using a conservative Social Security estimate. Run your numbers assuming you receive 75 to 80% of your projected benefit, rather than the full amount. What does your monthly cash flow look like under that assumption? If your plan still works, if your essential expenses are covered and you have a reasonable margin, then you have already built in a meaningful buffer. If benefits come in at 100%, that buffer becomes additional financial flexibility. Also, take time to stress test your plan in a few specific scenarios. What if you delay claiming Social Security by 2 or 3 years? What if your taxes on your benefits increase? What if your investment returns in the early years of retirement come in lower than your long-term average? Running through these scenarios, ideally with a financial professional, tells you where your plan is resilient and where it has weak points that need attention. Flexibility is your most powerful asset at this stage. Look for ways to increase the adjustable elements of your income plan. A mix of guaranteed income sources, withdrawable assets, and expenses that can be scaled up or down gives you far more resilience than a plan built entirely around fixed projections. If you are 25 or more years from retirement, the uncertainty about Social Security is higher at this distance, and that's actually useful information for how you should approach your planning. Rather than building Social Security into the foundation of your retirement income plan, treat it as a supplement, a longevity protection layer that will be there in some form, but that you don't need to rely on completely. When you design your plan this way, the specific dollar amount of your future benefit matters less than your overall savings rate, your investment approach, and the structure of your accounts. This is also a good time to think seriously about tax diversification. Many of the most realistic options for addressing the Social Security shortfall involve higher taxes on higher earners, whether through payroll tax increases, income tax changes, or changes to how Social Security benefits are taxed. If you are a high earner, having a genuine mix of pre-tax accounts like a traditional 401k or IRA, Roth accounts, and taxable investment accounts gives you flexibility to manage your tax exposure in retirement, regardless of what the tax environment looks like in 25 years. The fundamentals remain unchanged, regardless of what Congress eventually does with Social Security. Spend less than you earn, increase your savings rate over time, especially as your income grows, keep fixed monthly obligations manageable so that your budget has room to absorb changes. These are the things that genuinely determine retirement security, and they are entirely within your control. I want to close with something I feel strongly about. The amount of anxiety surrounding Social Security right now is understandable. When something as foundational as retirement income feels uncertain, it is natural to feel unsettled. But anxiety and clarity are not the same thing, and they don't lead to the same outcomes. What the facts actually show us is this: Social Security is not going away. The program has faced serious funding pressure before, and Congress acted, imperfectly, at the last minute, with a patchwork of tools rather than an elegant solution, but it acted. The same political and policy incentives that drove action in the past are still present today, arguably even stronger given how many Americans now depend on the program. Yes, the system will likely change. Higher earners may contribute more. The timeline for certain benefits may shift. Taxes on benefits for some recipients may increase. None of those things are comfortable, but none of them are the catastrophic collapse that some headlines suggest. The more clearly you understand what is actually at stake and what the realistic range of outcomes looks like, the better positioned you are to make decisions that serve your long-term security. You plan for the possibilities, you build in margin, you create flexibility, and you move forward. That is what retirement planning looks like when it's done well, not predicting the future perfectly, but building a plan that holds up across a range of futures. I'd love to hear your perspective on this. If you had to design the most fair and sustainable solution to the Social Security funding gap, what would you prioritize? Adjustments on the revenue side, on the benefit side, or some combination? Leave your answer in the comments below. These conversations genuinely matter, and I read every one. If this video gave you something useful to think about, a like goes a long way in helping this content reach more people who need it. If you're not subscribed yet, I put out a new video every week focused entirely on practical retirement and financial planning. I'd love to have you here. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.